Hi everyone, Roland here from graphicinmotion.com. In this video, I will walk you through the process of creating a stunning 3D artwork with audio-reactive particles using SideFX Houdini. But before we dive into the breakdown, let's take a moment to enjoy the final piece together. At the core of this artwork is a dynamic particle simulation driven by audio-responsive parameters. Everything from the emission and the emitter position to the color and the speed of the particles reacts to the music, creating a pretty immersive effect. And that brings us to the first key step, choosing the right soundtrack. That's where today's sponsor comes into play. This video is sponsored by Sonata, a music licensing platform designed to make finding the perfect track for your projects really easy. And that's actually also where I found the music track for this project. So let's check it out. If you've ever spent hours digging through endless stock music libraries, you know how frustrating it can be to find something that truly fits your project. And Sonata changes that. Their website is clean, modern and easy to navigate. It's a really seamless experience that helps you discover great music quickly. And speaking of the music, Sonata focuses on real artist tracks, not the generic or stocky music that you hear everywhere else. Their library is regularly added to with fresh selections, so you will always have access to high-quality, unique tracks that make your content stand out. Finding the right song is pretty effortless. By using their search parameters, you can filter by mood, genre, theme, or even instrumentals if you need a version without vocals. They also offer curated playlists to help spark inspiration. And if you're working on a project with a specific vibe, you can create custom collections, add tracks, mix and match, and fine-tune your selection before making a final choice. Pricing is straightforward and competitive, and on top of that, Sonata offers a perpetual license, meaning once you purchase a license, you can use the track in your project forever. No recurring fees, no complicated restrictions. So if you're looking for high-quality, artist-driven music to elevate your videos, check out Sonata. You will find a link in the video description. And now let me show you which track I chose and why I did that. The track that I chose is this one here. It's called 100 Stars Vanished. Let me show it to you. By Beneath the Mountain. And it is this very quiet piano piece. And I chose this track actually because of its tempo, its mood, but also because of its musical structure. If you listen to it closely, then in the beginning we have these very calm piano chords. And after the chord, we have a long period of this atmospheric pad. And that's exactly what I wanted, because I knew that I can emit particles with the impact of the chord, but then I have time that these particles can evolve in the particle simulation. So this is a really perfect match. And the other aspect that I like of this piece is that it increases its intensity over its duration. It starts out quiet in the beginning, and you can already see this here in this waveform pretty good. And then it picks up volume and gets brighter. And this will, of course, then intensify our simulation. And that's exactly what I actually wanted to use. So I chose this really great track, 100 Stars Vanished, from Beneath the Mountain. And now let's finally dive into Houdini and let's check out how to create this project. At first, I want to give you a quick overview over the structure of this project. So let's take a look at this particle simulation geometry node here. If you want to reverse engineer this project file, you can get it on Patreon and also on Gumroad. The links will be in the video description. And basically it is split into three parts. The first part over here is this audio reaction setup, and that is inside the chop network. If we dive inside here, you see these nodes extract all these different data from our audio file that will then drive different parameters inside the particle simulation. So let's go back here and switch back to the scene view. Then over here, and that is this part here, we have the particle simulation. On top here, we have our particle source. Then inside the DOP network, we have the particle simulation itself. And wherever you find these red nodes here, that means that there is some kind of audio reaction happening. Here, I just clean up the particle simulation and save it to disk. And this over here is a volume-based velocity field that drives these particles and creates these really nice swirly patterns here. Then on the stage context in Solaris, there is the setup of the instancer, where I'm instancing these objects here, these little boxes, onto the particles. And then I just added a very simple scene with a dome light, a camera, and rendered this out. And now let's take a closer look how this was built. First of all, let's take a look at the particle source. I'm just using a sphere here and creating a density attribute on this sphere. In the density attribute, we have the first reaction to music, and this is happening right here in the offset. That means that with each chord on our piano, the position of this density attribute here changes on the sphere. Then I'm scattering points based on this density value onto the sphere, and these points will be the source points for our particle simulation. Additionally, I'm randomizing the position of the sphere within a certain range, as you can see here. And this again has some audio reaction in it. I just created a little script here in Vex that assigns random position values to X, Y, and Z, depending on this minimum and maximum range here. And they are just looking at this seed. And the seed is actually the value that is controlled by the audio reaction. So whenever a chord hits, this seed will change. Then I'm setting a velocity here. And the velocity is just an attributed just vector node. And I'm just changing the directions a little bit using a noise pattern here, so that we get a bit more of an interesting emission into our system, that these particles don't shoot out just along the normals or straight. I'm just varying their direction a little bit to spread them in an interesting way into our simulation. In the end, I'm just multiplying the density attribute from up here with the velocity that I created here to vary the initial speed of the particles. Wherever the density is lower, the speed will be slower, and wherever the density is high, the particles will be faster. And that's actually the whole setup of the particle source. Let's take a quick look how this looks like without the velocity field. So I will go into my DOP network here, turn off all the visualizers, and I will also disable this velocity field here, the pop Advect by volumes node. And now I will only see the initial particles, so the initial emission. Before I play this, let me mention that I also have some audio reaction on the pop source. I'm controlling this impulse activation here also with the music. That means whenever we have a chord playing, the impulse will be activated and will emit particles. If I turn on the music for a moment, and then we will see, we should see this here. Right now we don't, so let me quickly check what's going on here. Let me quickly relink this and try whether this will work. Yeah, now it works. You see, now we have the music here in our timeline. And then we can see this a little bit better when these chords are played, and then we will also see how this value here will change. So I will just play a few frames here. I have to zoom out a bit. The particles are quite fast because now we have no velocity volume that is taking over and moving them. Now they just shoot out with the initial velocity that I created in the particle source. But you already see that On each of these chords that you can very clearly see here in the waveform, particles are emitted into our system. And then I'm just adding this pop advect by volumes here. And this actually takes a look at the result of this network here. So here I'm creating a velocity field. And if you want to really learn how this is done, I would recommend that you go and watch the amazing tutorial by Simon Fiedler. That's actually how I learned this technique a few years ago. It is available on the Entagma YouTube channel, and I will put a link in the video description. I will just walk you through this now very quickly. So you basically just create a sphere and distort it with a mountain node. And this is also slightly animated so that it changes a bit over time. Then you're adding normals to the points. This is an important step because we need these normals to calculate these swirly patterns later on. Now you want to feed this basic shape into a VDB, and that's this setup here. Basically, you create an empty VDB, and here it is important that you create the right type. That means a displacement, velocity, and acceleration vector type. You also want to make sure that the name of the volume is vel for velocity, and that it is a fork volume. And the type should be vector float. So that's all that is important here for now. With the voxel size, you can determine the resolution of your volume. But for these kind of advection effects, you actually don't need a very low-res volume. Another important step here is to add a bounding box around this. If I template the bound here, you see that I actually added a lot of padding to all the sides here, that your volume is bigger than the initial geometry, that you can also create velocities that are a little bit outside of your geometry that flow around your object. And then you activate this whole setup with a pop activate. And here it is important that you switch this to reference. Now we have an active VDB, but we still don't have any velocity data in here. And the velocity data is calculated in this volume warp here. I will not explain this now in full detail. As I said, if you want to learn that, check out Simon Fiedler's tutorial. But just to give you a very quick breakdown, what's happening in here is that we bring in our point cloud. That means the point cloud here from our mesh directly from here is fed into the second input of our volume warp. And then it is just referenced in with this PC open node here. We are grabbing the position of our volume, and we are grabbing the output here, the data from our point cloud. Now we are filtering out two different parameters. First of all, the position here. So we are just filtering the channel P. That's the position of our points actually. And we also filter out the normals of our points. And then we subtract the position of our voxels. So this is actually the position of the voxels of our volume from the position of our point cloud. That way we create a directional vector between each point of our point cloud, of our object, and the voxels. We are normalizing these vectors here so that they are all in the same length. And then we are calculating the cross product of these directional vectors from the normals of our point cloud. And if you did everything right and create this field visualization here, then you should get something like this. You get this really cool swirly trails here. And that is actually a visualization of the velocity directions that we have in this volume field. And if I scroll through my timeline, you see that this is also changing over time because, of course, our base mesh here is animating slightly. Now, if we feed this here, the result of this volume warp now into our particle simulation right here, then our particles will do these very nice swirls. Now, let me take a look at this audio reaction here, because on this node, there's also an audio reaction. I will just revert back here so that it is not calculating everything. The only parameter that I'm controlling here with an audio reaction is actually the velocity scale. That means whenever my audio gets louder, when the volume is higher, the velocity scale of this whole field will increase and the particles will move faster through all of these nice directional swirls. If we take a look here in the beginning, of course, it is only 1. And then if it gets louder, you will see that the velocity scale increases. Now we cannot see it because it tries to calculate the simulation until to this point. I don't want that. So let me quickly end this. I will just turn off my solver for a moment. But now you can see that in an area where the volume of my music is louder, the velocity will change and will go up. That means that my particles will then move faster through the field. And that's the only audio reaction I have in this velocity field. Another thing that is important here is that I remapped the force over the age of the particles. Because right in the beginning, when they are emitting with our initial velocity, I didn't want them to be influenced by the velocity field. I wanted them to spread a little bit with their initial velocity, and then after a short amount of time, the velocity field takes over and starts to move these particles around. And that's basically everything I did here. I just added a little bit of colorizing here. I added particle color from speed. So I just created this ramp here from black to white that is mapped over the range from 0 to 1.5. That is approximately the speed here. And this creates these shades here on our particles. I used this data later on to colorize this in the shading process. And then I also added in this little script here that scales the particles over life so that they scale in the beginning and then they scale down in the end. And there's also a little randomness going on here so that these particles have different sizes. And that's everything that I do here. And now let's take a look at the probably most important part or most interesting part for you guys. And that is the audio reaction part. How do we get all of this data out of an audio file? I'll switch over to the Motion Effects view here, and I will just start up here. I have to hold Control and click one of these nodes to solo these, because in a job network we can activate multiple of these display flags. So let's take a look first of all at this file here. That is the audio file that I downloaded from Sonata. And as you can see here, there are actually two channels because it is a stereo signal. And it has also very intense data. If we zoom in here, you see that an audio wave contains a lot of data. If we middle mouse click on this node, we get a little bit of information. So here we have the two channels, channel 0 and channel 1. And you also see that the sample rate here is 44,100 per second. That is the standard sample rate for CD quality audio. So the first step here is to prepare this audio to make it a little bit more user-friendly for our task here. If you want to know how you can listen to an audio in Houdini, the easiest way in my opinion is that you create a null object, as I did here, called it Audio Preview, and then, you already saw this, you come down here to this audio panel, and under Scrub there is this job reference field, and you can just drag it in here. The advantage of this workflow is that if you manipulate the audio, for example, if you run it through a pass filter and filter out some frequencies, then you can just connect this null here to a different location in your network, and you will hear and see the waveform here. This can be very useful. In my case, it doesn't really matter because I didn't use any frequency passes, but yeah, it's a good practice. What I'm doing here is, first of all, I'm deleting one of these channels. We can see this here. So if I activate this one here, we are left only with one channel because I actually don't need stereo data. For me, one channel is enough. Then I'm resampling this. So from 44,100 per second, I resample it down to a rate of around 100 or 96 in this case. The only thing that this does is that it reduces the amount of data. And if we zoom in here, we can see this, that now we still have a lot, but not that much anymore as before. I'm trying to keep the overall shape of this waveform though. So if I change this interpolation to linear, which is the default, you see that I lose quite a bit of range here. My values here are very small. That's why I changed the interpolation to no interpolation, and then I more or less get the same structure or the same form, as you can see here, as my original audio. I still can see all of these peaks here, and that represent actually the chords on the piano, and that is important that I still have this data here so that I can react to these. Then I'm only filtering out the positive values here with this math node, because in my case, I don't need any negative values in my reaction. Depending on what you want to do, negative values can also be very helpful or very handy. But in this case, I didn't need them, so I just filtered this out. So this is the basic audio preparation. It's not the only audio preparation that you can do. There are multiple ways to extract the data that you want. For example, if you are extracting it from a beat, then you could put in a pass filter, filter out certain frequencies like lower frequencies for a kick drum or higher frequencies for a snare or a hi-hat. In my case, there are no drums, nothing. I only need this waveform here to see where the chords are played. Now I'm creating these different reactions. And let's take a look at the first one, which controls the emission of our particles. The emission of our particles requires a value between 0 and 1. So whenever the particles should not be emitted, we want to have a value of 0. And whenever we want particles to emit to our system, we need a value of 1. And that's called a trigger-based reaction. And that's what I built here with only these 3 nodes. The first node is not even necessary. It is just an envelope that makes it a little bit simpler to recognize or to see the peaks and the shape of our audio. If we solo that, you see what this does. It just creates, more or less this envelope around the shape of our filtered or of our positive values here. Then this one here just trims the end because I didn't want to have any audio reactions anymore in the end. As you can see here, this is just a trim node where you can trim your audio data. And this one here is the really important one, that is the trigger node. And if we take a look at the trigger node, and I will just press H here to zoom out a bit. And I have to go a little bit closer in here that you see what's happening in here. With the trigger node, you can set up a certain threshold here. And whenever your waveform, so this green line here, reaches this threshold value, then the trigger will export a trigger. In my case, I set the trigger up that it is just putting out a value of 1.1 for the duration of 0.36 seconds. I guess that it's seconds. And that means now that whenever this value is up here, I will emit particles into my system. And if we take a look at that, you see that this will now follow the rhythm of the music or of the notes or the musical impacts that we have here. And now I'm exporting this using an export node. And to do that, you can come in here to the node, then you search the node wherever the parameter is sitting. In my case, it is the impulse activation parameter that is on the pop source inside my DOP network here. And then you have to put in the name of the parameter. And you can find the name of these parameters. Let me show you this here in the DOP network. If you hover with your mouse over this name here, then in this information there is this parameter name, and that's the one that you want to use. So you don't want to use the name that you see here in the interface. You want to use the name that is written here on the parameter, this small one, impulse activate, all written together. So that's the name that you want. And each of these parameters has this kind of a name here, as you can see. So whatever you want to control here, you can just memorize this parameter name, and then you just have to write it here into your export node, into the path. And now, and you already saw this now, this will now turn yellow. And if you click on it, you can also see by which node this is actually overwritten or controlled. In my case, it's the export emission channel 1. So wherever you see these yellow overlays, that means that this is controlled by our job network. Okay, so this is the first reaction. This is a trigger-based emission for particles reaction. And then I have these 2 random position seeds. And a seed value, of course, will not work if it just changes between 0 and 1. You want to have a value that changes or increases or decreases over time. You could also create a random value. But with the audio reaction, there is a very simple technique to create seed values following a rhythm. And this is this count node here. The only thing that this actually does is that it counts whenever it reaches a certain trigger threshold. And because I set this trigger threshold to 1, it now counts all of my triggers here. So I'm just branching off this trigger, feeding it in here. And if you take a look at this red line now, you see whenever our trigger is activated, we are counting up 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. And this is now a perfect seed value that also follows the rhythm of our music. And that's really handy because whatever is controlled by a seed can be controlled by audio using this combination of a trigger and a count. The only thing that I did here is that I shifted it a bit because I wanted this change to happen before we emit particles. So I wanted the position change of my emitter and also the change of the density value to happen before the particles are actually emitted, not at the same time, because then there may be some overlap here. So I just shifted it in front a little bit, which is this blue line now. And I'm exporting this to two locations, to two parameters in my simulation here, and actually not in the simulation itself, but in the source here. And I already showed you this. First of all, I have it in here in this offset value. That's not actually a seed, but it is kind of a positional seed. It is an offset value that just offsets the noise pattern on the surface. If we visualize this, I just have to turn on the visualizers here. You see that with each musical accent, now this changes and will create a random direction of emission and a random pattern. And the same applies for this wrangle here with the position. This also will change randomly with each chord. Okay, now the last audio reaction that I created is over here, and this is a little bit different. The first ones, or the first two, were based on triggers. Now this one here is based on the volume of this audio. If you're not familiar with audio files and waveforms, you can actually see the volume in a waveform. So wherever the amplitude of this waveform is high, the volume of the music is louder, of course, is higher. And whenever the amplitude is lower, then the volume is also lower. And from this math node here that I created, from these filtered positive values here, I'm just creating an envelope, as you can see here. And then I'm filtering this envelope, and filtering means blurring, more or less. So let's turn this off for a moment, and you see what I'm doing here. If I zoom in here. So from this very complex envelope, I'm now just blurring this. And you can see that this is just a Gaussian operation, like a blur. And I end up with this value here. Now, this is a way smoother change of values, and that's more useful if you want to change velocities. If you would feed this into a velocity, this would be just crazy because it changes all the time. But if you filter it and smooth it out, then it will be more useful. But the problem here is that it's not in the right range. As you can see here now, the value ranges from 0 and it not even reaches 1. So I'm using a math node here to increase this overall amplitude. If we take a look at that now. And with a math node, you can not only do some operations here, like positive, negative, root and all that stuff, where you can also do some adding and multiplying, but you can also remap the range of a value. So what I did is that I changed the range from 0 to 1, I remapped it to 0 to about 10. And that's what you can see here now. I'm just increasing the amplitude of this curve here. Now the problem with this curve, the blue one, is that it still has a range that's not really very useful in a velocity field, because in the beginning we have very low values. That would mean that my particles would not move at all. And here we have values that are really high, and that means that they will move like crazy fast. So what I did here is just clamp these using a limit. And this is this pink curve now. And I just clamped it to a range from 1 to 2.25. That's the only thing I did here. And then I'm exporting this into the velocity scale of our volume Advect node. So the pop Advect by volume it's called. And you already saw this. This is here inside the dot network, and it is right here. And this is the velocity scale that is now controlled by the audio. Okay, so this was a short breakdown of all the audio reaction techniques. If you want to learn these techniques in more detail and add a few more to your arsenal, I have a premium course available on my Patreon where I walk you through the whole process of an audio reactive project from start to finish. It is available with the full access tier, but you can also just purchase it separately with a one-time payment. If we take a look now what this does. So let's take a look at the cache here, and I will just turn off all the visualizers. This is the particle simulation that I created with this setup. And you see already, whenever the music is getting a bit louder, the particles get brighter on one hand and also faster. And that is, of course, because the speed controls also the color of these particles. So that's also pretty handy because I can use this now in a shader and colorize these, and the colors will change according to their speed. So yeah, this is the setup. And now let's take a very quick look at the Solaris network that I created. The most important thing here is definitely the instancer. And if you're not familiar how to instance in Solaris, I made 2 separate tutorials on my YouTube channel about that. I will link them in the video description. And I will also put it now on screen. And the instancer, the point instancer in Solaris actually requires USD files. So you see here I have these reference nodes that are actually loading in USD files from disk, as you can see here. And I just created these USD files here in this instance objects node here. And this is very basic. You see it's just a box with a bevel and 3 different variations here. And then I'm just exporting these using a USD export, and I save these to disk as a USD. That's all I'm doing here. And with these reference nodes here on the Solaris stage, I'm loading these in. So it's the first one, second one, third one. The first one I just scaled it up a little bit because it was a bit too small. And then I'm feeding this into the second input of the instancer. Now, of course, you need to import these source particles as well. And in the instancer, when you set it to internal SOP, you can dive inside by double-clicking, and then you can just merge in the result of your simulation. So this object merge just points to my simulation result, to exactly this node here, to this one here. So I'm just referencing in here the outcome of my particle simulation, and I feed it into my instancer. That's all I'm doing here. And then the instancer will take over all the attributes that are still on your particles. And there's one important thing that I want to mention here. You have to think about which attributes you want to keep in this simulation. Let me quickly take a look at that, because this is really important. Before caching it to disk, I am of course cleaning it up because I don't want to save all these 21 point attributes. I reduced this down to 6. But it is important that you think about what you need. In my case, I wanted to keep the color, the CD, because this is actually representing the speed of my particles. Then very important is the ID of the particles, because that ID is required by the instancer, so that these objects that you then copy on a particle will stay the same throughout the lifespan of a particle. Then you want to keep the p-scale. This is also read out by the instancer. And I just kept the density, which I actually didn't use. Then of course you need the position. And I also kept the velocity for motion blur effects. So that's all that I needed here. And the instancer will read out all of this data. And you have all this data now available in your stage context. The next node that is just a transform node that is just rotating this whole particle simulation so that we have a little bit of an angle change throughout this simulation. And then I'm adding the material, and this is also really very simple. It is just one material that is applied to the particles, in this case to the instancer. The only attribute that I'm reading in here is the display color, so the CD attribute, and I'm just ramping this or remapping this to these values, to these colors here. And that's all I do. The other setup is just a straightforward plastic setup. Yeah, then we are assigning this material, adding a simple dome light to the scene, adding a very simple camera movement with a bit of animated focus distance and a bit of depth of field. And then a very simple camera render setting where I just add a little bit of motion blur. And then I rendered this out in a square format. And then I can extract a 16:9 and a 9:16 version for social media and for YouTube. Okay, so this is it with this video. I hope that you liked it, that you found some inspiration for your own projects. If you like my work, then please consider supporting me on Patreon. And don't forget to check out Sonata and their awesome music library. So thank you very much for watching, and I really hope to see you soon. Goodbye.